What really happened to the battleship Yamashiro? In the darkness before dawn on October 25, 1944, a massive steel fortress cut through the waters of Surigao Strait in the Philippines. The battleship Yamashiro, whose name meant mountain castle, was steaming toward what would become the last battleship-versus-battleship engagement in naval history. By sunrise, she would be gone. Along with her, 1,626 officers and crew would vanish beneath the waves. And with them would die the age of the battleship itself. This is the story of what really happened to the Yamashiro. Our story begins 3 decades earlier, in a Japan racing to build a world-class navy. On November 20, 1913, workers at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal laid down the keel of what would become Japan's second Fuso-class battleship. The design was ambitious, perhaps too ambitious. Yamashiro would be 673 feet long, with a beam of 94 feet. She would displace nearly 30,000 tons. But most impressively, she would carry 12 14-inch guns in 6 twin turrets. An unprecedented concentration of firepower that earned her the distinction of being called the most powerfully armed battleship in the world when she was completed. On November 3, 1915, Yamashiro slid down the ways into the water for the first time. 18 months later, on March 31, 1917, she was formally commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. But there was a problem. The ship that looked so impressive on paper had fundamental design flaws that would plague her throughout her entire career. You see, in their eagerness to pack as much firepower as possible onto the hull, Japanese naval architects had created a ship that was unbalanced and difficult to handle. The 6 turrets required an enormous amount of internal space, compromising the armor protection. The ship's center of gravity was too high, making her unstable in rough seas. Worse still, despite extensive modernization in the 1930s, Yamashiro's 14-inch guns would eventually be outclassed by newer battleships mounting 16-inch and even 18-inch weapons. By the time World War II began, Yamashiro was already obsolescent, a fact that would shape her entire wartime career. Yamashiro's early years were relatively uneventful. She patrolled the Chinese coast during World War I but saw no action. In 1922, she made history by becoming the first Japanese battleship to successfully launch aircraft from her deck, a pioneering achievement in naval aviation. Between December 1930 and March 1935, Yamashiro underwent a massive reconstruction at Yokosuka. The work was extensive. New boilers, enhanced armor, improved underwater protection against torpedoes. But the most striking change was visual. Rising from her deck, engineers built a massive pagoda-style superstructure, a towering edifice of platforms, observation posts, and fire control stations stacked one upon another. To modernize, it looks almost absurd, like someone had built an apartment building on top of a warship. But this bizarre tower served a purpose. It gave spotters and rangefinders the height they needed to see targets at maximum range. The modernized Yamashiro emerged as a ship transformed. She looked powerful and modern, but appearances were deceiving. The fundamental design flaws remained, and the world of naval warfare was changing in ways that would leave ships like Yamashiro behind. December 8, 1941, Japan launched its surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, plunging the Pacific into war. Yamashiro sortied from her anchorage at Hashirajima in Hiroshima Bay as part of a distant support force, but she never saw action. By the time she reached the Bonin Islands, the attack was over. It was a pattern that would define most of Yamashiro's war. She was kept in reserve, used for training duties, relegated to second-line status. The Imperial Japanese Navy knew the future belonged to aircraft carriers, not aging battleships. Ships like Yamashiro were too valuable to risk, too outdated to be decisive. On April 18, 1942, American bombers launched from the carrier Hornet struck Tokyo in the famous Doolittle raid. Yamashiro was sent to chase down the American task force. She returned 4 days later without having made contact, another mission ending in futility. In May 1942, Yamashiro set sail as part of the support force for the attack on Midway Island. She never got close to the action. The battle turned into a catastrophic defeat for Japan. 4 carriers sunk, the tide of the Pacific War irreversibly turned. There was even talk of converting Yamashiro into a hybrid battleship carrier to replace some of the lost flat tops. The Navy considered cutting away part of her superstructure and building a flight deck aft. But ultimately, 2 other ships, the Issei and Hyuga, were chosen for conversion instead. Yamashiro would remain a pure battleship. For the next 2 years, from 1942 to 1944, Yamashiro led a quiet existence. She conducted training exercises in the inland sea. She served as a target for bombers. She became a training ship for midshipmen. In November 1943, she even survived a dud torpedo hit from the submarine USS Halibut. The weapon struck home but failed to explode. It must have seemed to her crew that the war would pass them by entirely, that the great battles would be fought by others while they endured the tedium of training cruises and standby alerts. They were wrong.
The plan was called Sho-Go, Victory Operation. It was incredibly complex, almost baroque in its intricacy. And like many desperate plans, it depended on everything going exactly right. The Japanese would attack from 3 directions simultaneously. A powerful center force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, including the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, would thread through the San Bernardino Strait and attack from the north. A northern force of carriers under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would approach from the north as a decoy, deliberately sacrificing itself to draw away the American fast carriers and battleships. And from the south would come the southern force, 2 separate squadrons that would converge on Leyte Gulf through the Surigao Strait. It was command of this southern force that fell to Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, and Nishimura's flagship would be the Yamashiro. Shoji Nishimura was 54 years old, a career naval officer who had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1911. He had a reputation for being a stickler for orders, a man who would carry out his mission no matter the cost. That reputation would prove tragically prophetic. Nishimura's force, officially designated Force C, consisted of 7 ships. The 2 battleships, Fuso, Yamashiro's sister ship, and Yamashiro herself as flagship. The heavy cruiser Mogami, and 4 destroyers, Michishio, Asagumo, Yamagumo, and Shigure. It was not a strong force. The 2 battleships were old and slow. The cruiser had been damaged in previous battles. The destroyer screen was thin. But it was what Japan could spare for this desperate mission. Following behind Nishimura by several hours would be another small force, under Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima, 3 more cruisers and 4 destroyers. The 2 admirals were supposed to coordinate their movements, but the strict radio silence imposed for the operation made this nearly impossible. At 3:30 in the afternoon on October 22, 1944, Nishimura's force departed from Brunei in Borneo. They headed east into the Sulu Sea, then turned northeast into the Mindanao Sea, making for the southern entrance to Surigao Strait. For a day and a half, they remained undetected. It must have given Nishimura hope that perhaps, just perhaps, they might achieve surprise. That hope was shattered on the afternoon of October 24th. American carrier planes from Task Force 38 found them. Dive bombers and torpedo planes swept down on the Japanese column. A bomb exploded near Yamashiro, and Oldendorf had set a trap. At the northern exit of Surigao Strait, he deployed his forces in layers. First, 39 PT boats, small, fast torpedo boats that would harass the Japanese as they entered the strait. Behind them, 2 squadrons of destroyers, ready to launch devastating torpedo attacks. Behind the destroyers, a line of 8 cruisers, 4 heavy, 4 light. And across the northern mouth of the strait, in a position that naval tacticians call crossing the T, Oldendorf placed 6 battleships. 5 of those battleships had been at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. West Virginia, Tennessee, California, Maryland, and Pennsylvania had all been damaged or sunk that day. Now, rebuilt and modernized, they would have their revenge. Late on October 24th, as darkness fell, Nishimura knew he was sailing into a trap. A scout plane from the cruiser Mogami had reported the American fleet ahead. The pilot's message was clear. Powerful enemy forces were waiting in the strait. Any reasonable commander would have turned back. The mission was already compromised. Surprise was lost. The odds were hopeless. But Nishimura was not a man who disobeyed orders. Some historians believe he was driven by the samurai code of Bushido, the warrior's way that valued honor and obedience above life itself. Others suggest he simply couldn't imagine abandoning the plan, couldn't bear to fail his country in its hour of desperate need. Or perhaps, and this is the darkest possibility, perhaps Nishimura knew his force was expendable. Perhaps he understood that even in defeat, even in death, he could serve a purpose: to draw American attention south, to create confusion, to give Kurita's more powerful center force a better chance of breaking through from the north. Whatever his reasoning, Nishimura reduced speed to 12 knots and continued north into Surigao Strait. Behind him, his second-in-command on the battleship Fuso signaled a simple message: "We pray for your success in battle." At 10:36 p.m. on October 24th, the first American PT boats made contact. These small vessels, just 80 feet long, armed with torpedoes and machine guns, began to harass the Japanese column like wolves nipping at a wounded bear. The engagement was chaotic. In the darkness, the PT boats darted in and out, trying to get close enough to launch torpedoes. The Japanese responded with searchlights and gunfire. Shells erupted in the water around the small American boats. Tracers streaked through the night. The PT boats achieved little damage, but they accomplished something perhaps more important. They reported Nishimura's exact position, course, and speed to Oldendorf. She went down in less than 200 meters of water, her hull inverted, settling onto the seabed of Surigao Strait. Admiral Nishimura went down with his ship. Of Yamashiro's crew of approximately 1,636 officers and men, estimates suggest fewer than 10 survived. The Battle of Surigao Strait was over. It had lasted just a few hours. Of Nishimura's 7 ships, 5 had been sunk. The heavy cruiser Mogami, riddled with damage, would limp away only to be sunk by air attack later that day. Only the destroyer Shigura escaped, carrying the tale of the Southern forces' destruction. Vice Admiral Shima's trailing force, arriving to find the strait filled with burning wrecks and overwhelming American firepower, wisely turned back. The larger Battle of Leyte Gulf would continue for another 2 days, becoming the largest naval engagement in history. But Surigao Strait holds a unique place in naval history. It was the last time battleships would fight battleships in a traditional battle line. It was the last time the classic naval tactic of crossing the T would be executed in actual combat. It was, in many ways, the last hurrah of the battleship era, and it belonged to the Americans. 5 of the 6 American battleships at Surigao Strait had been at Pearl Harbor. They had been caught by surprise, sunk or damaged in the shallow waters of the harbor. But they had been raised, rebuilt, and returned to service. Now they had struck back, avenging that day of infamy with overwhelming firepower. The symmetry was not lost on those who fought there. Captain Roland Smoot of the destroyer Claxton later wrote,
It was like an election bet being paid off. For decades, the location of Yamashiro's wreck was known only approximately. The coordinates from the battle were rough, based on nighttime sightings and radar fixes. The strait is deep, the currents are treacherous, and the waters are often murky. But in recent years, modern sonar technology has allowed researchers to locate and survey the wreck site. What they found tells the final chapter of Yamashiro's story. The battleship lies at a depth of approximately 210 meters, nearly 700 feet down, on the floor of Surigao Strait. She rests upside down, her massive hull inverted. The bow section, extending back to the main turrets, is remarkably intact. The armored citadel that protected her magazines and machinery spaces survived the sinking. Her 14-inch guns remain in place, the barrels largely undamaged, though now pointing downward into the mud. Visible scars on the port side show where torpedoes struck. Gaping holes near the engine room and amidships, consistent with the multiple impacts she took during the destroyer attacks. But surprisingly, there's little evidence of extensive shell fire penetration. Most of the devastating damage from the battle.
The sinking of Yamashiro marked more than just the loss of a ship. It represented the end of an era in naval warfare. For centuries, battleships had been the ultimate expression of naval power. They were steel fortresses, bristling with guns, symbols of national might and military prowess. Nations bankrupted themselves building them. Naval tactics revolved around them. The battle line, ships arranged in a column, maximizing their broadside firepower, had dominated naval thinking since the age of sail. But technology had moved on. Aircraft carriers had proven themselves as the new capital ships. Submarines posed threats that surface ships couldn't easily counter. Radar and guided weapons would soon make the battleship obsolete. Yamashiro was built in a world where battleships were supreme. She died in a world where they were dinosaurs. Ironically, the Battle of Surigao Strait was itself almost anachronistic, a throwback to an earlier form of naval combat. The only reason it happened at all was because Japan, desperate and nearly defeated, threw its older battleships into a last-ditch gamble. And the only reason the Americans were able to achieve such a perfect battle line engagement was that Oldorf's battleships had been relegated to shore bombardment duty, considered too slow and vulnerable for the fleet actions that now revolved around carriers. So what really happened to the battleship Yamashiro? In the simplest sense, she was sunk in battle. Outgunned, outmaneuvered, overwhelmed by superior force. But the deeper truth is more complex. Yamashiro was a victim of changing times. She was designed for a style of warfare that was already passing away. Despite modernization, despite brave crews and determined commanders, she couldn't overcome the fundamental obsolescence of her design. She was sent on a mission that was doomed from the start, a desperate gamble that depended on everything going right, launched by a nation that had already lost the strategic initiative and was fighting now from desperation rather than strength. Questions remain. Why did Nishimura continue into the strait when he knew he faced overwhelming force? Was it Bushido, the code of the warrior? Was it a deliberate sacrifice to divert American attention? Was it simply an inability to deviate from the plan, a rigid adherence to orders that cost him his life and the lives of his men? We'll never know. Nishimura went down with his ship, taking his reasoning with him. Today, Yamashiro rests on the seabed of Surigao Strait, slowly being claimed by the ocean. She's considered an extremely challenging dive site, deep, remote, with treacherous currents. Few have visited her grave. In Surigao City in the Philippines, a museum commemorates the battle. Recently, a Japanese artist donated a painting showing Nishimura's force departing Brunei for their final mission. It's a gesture of remembrance, a recognition that this was a human tragedy as well as a military engagement. For the men who died aboard Yamashiro,
and her sister ship Fuso, and the destroyers and cruisers that accompanied them. The battle was not about grand strategy or the evolution of naval warfare. It was about duty, fear, courage, and ultimately death in service to their country. They deserve to be remembered, even as we recognize the futility of their mission and the obsolescence of their ship. The battleship Yamashiro was commissioned in 1917 and sank in 1944. She served for 27 years, most of them spent in training exercises, patrols, and peacetime duties. Her moment of true combat lasted less than 30 minutes. In that brief, violent span, she became part of history, a participant in the last battleship duel ever fought. She represents both the pinnacle and the end of an era. Her story is one of technological obsolescence, strategic desperation, human courage, and ultimate tragedy. What really happened to the battleship Yamashiro? She was born into a world of steel and gunpowder, of battle lines and broadside duels. She died in that world even as it was vanishing around her. And now she lies beneath the waves, a monument to the age of the battleship. An age that ended in the dark waters of Surigao Strait on October 25, 1944. Thanks so much for watching this documentary on the battleship Yamashiro. If you enjoyed this deep dive into naval history, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss our next video. We've got more incredible World War II naval stories coming up, including the hunt for the Bismarck, the carrier battle at Medway, and the mysterious disappearance of USS Indianapolis. If you'd like to support our work and help us create more detailed historical documentaries like this one, check out the links in the description below. And let us know in the comments, what naval battle would you like us to cover next? Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.